today's sections and notes, we're going to be focusing on the territorial dimensions of politics. Now, your central question is, if we have boundaries, then why do we still have problems in regards to our borders of countries? Now, the first thing I want to do is to actually identify what a boundary is. A boundary is a state that's separated from its neighbors by a boundary. It is an invisible line that marks the extent of a state's territory. Today, we're not going to be looking at how these boundaries are set. That's the next lesson. We're going to be looking at just the actual boundaries themselves. There's two types of boundaries that I want to look at. The first is physical boundaries, and the second is a cultural boundary. But a physical boundary, there's a couple of different things a physical boundary can be. There's desert boundaries, which can effectively divide two states because they're hard to cross, and there's really not a lot of people there. There's also mountain boundaries. Mountain boundaries can be effective if they're difficult to cross. They can be permanent in sparsely populated areas. Areas like Argentina and Chile, they agreed as mountain boundaries for their political borders. But then the question came up as, well, what is the boundary? Is the boundary from crest to crest? Is it a jagged line that connects the peaks? Or is it the continental divide line, this curving continental divide? And they almost went to war over this until the United States mediators stepped in and helped them agree that it was actually a jagged line from peak to peak. Now, you've also got water boundaries. Water boundaries are your most commonly used boundaries. They're readily visible on maps and aerial images. And historically, water boundaries have offered good protection from invading forces because troops, you can't just walk across water. Jesus can, but troops can't. And so they've been good protection. Now, in East Africa, water boundaries are common. For example, the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Uganda have Lake Albert. Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda have Lake Victoria. Burundi, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Tanzania, and Zambia have Lake Tanganyika. Democratic Republic of the Congo and Zambia have Lake Mwera, and Malawi and Mozambique have Lake Nyasa. Now, it's not important that you get each one of those, but understand that East Africa uses water boundaries more than a lot of places. Now, water boundaries may seem permanent, but a lot of times that's not the case. For example, the Rio Grande frequently meanders, and it took the International Boundary and Water Commission, which is a jointly staffed United States and Mexican government board, to actually oversee the treaties and to settle any disputes that may be caused as the water boundaries shift. Now, there's also what's known as the law of the sea. Some states have ocean boundaries and some do not. The ones that do are able to claim vast areas of the ocean for defense and for control of valuable fishing areas. Beginning in the late 18th century, some states recognized a boundary known as the territorial limit, which extended 3 nautical miles from the shore into the ocean. Some states claimed more extensive territorial limits, and others identified a contiguous zone of influence that extended beyond the territorial limits. The law of the sea, which was signed by 158 countries, has standardized the territorial limits for most countries at 12 nautical miles, or 14 land miles. Under the law of the sea, states also have exclusive rights to the fish and other marine life within 200 miles. Disputes can be taken to a tribunal for the law of the sea or to the International Court of Justice. Now, cultural boundaries. There's a couple of different types. The first is a geometric boundary, and this is like a straight line. The United States and Canada has a 1,300-mile straight line stretch that's created, which is a geometric boundary, and generally they are straight lines. Now, there's also ethnic boundaries. Ethnic boundaries separate speakers of different languages. It can also be religious ethnic boundaries. For example, in India, the British gave Muslims Pakistan and the Hindus India. They broke it apart because used to it was one big country, but they broke it apart among religions and gave Pakistan the Muslims and India to the Hindus. Europe coalesced because of different languages. Before the 19th century, in other words, they created countries around different languages. And then you got the example of Cyprus. Cyprus has a green line boundary. Cyprus is made up of Greeks and Turkish people. And in 1960, Cyprus gained its independence from Great Britain. And the Greeks and Turkish people almost integrated, but they didn't successfully do so. A wall was constructed between the two areas, and a buffer zone was created so that issues would not arise. Now, to our next major title, Concepts of Power and Territoriality. First, I want to identify what a state is. A state is an area organized into a political unit and ruled by an established government that has control over its internal and foreign affairs. In other words, it's the same thing as a country. A state has sovereignty, which means it has independence from control of its internal affairs by other states, meaning it controls itself, it rules itself. Now, moving on to the idea of a state versus a territory. First is, I want to look at Korea. Korea, is it one state or two? Korea was a Japanese colony for many years, and after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union split up Korea after the defeat of Japan because they wanted to be able to control it more. And you can probably guess who controlled which side. North was being controlled by the Soviet Union, South by the United States. Both North and South Korea wanted and still want to unite to one Korea, but the decision was halted and slowed down when North Korea pursued nuclear weapons in 2000. And then you have the case of Taiwan. Is it one state or two? Most countries recognize Taiwan as a sovereign nation, but China doesn't. A little bit of history of Taiwan. During the Glorious Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the communists pushed the nationalists out, which the nationalists wanted democracy. The nationalist people and President Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan and still live there today. And they say that they're an independent nation when a lot of people say they're not. The case of Western Sahara, the Saharan Republic, is it one state or two? Morocco claims the territory. Spain controlled the territory until about 1976 and then gave it up. Morocco claims the populated area, and there's a group called the Polisario Front, and they operate in the inhabited area, but it's kind of a split region, and we're not sure if it's one state or two. And then your polar regions. There's many claims to these polar regions. The South Pole is the only large landmass not a part of any state. In Antarctica, Argentina, Australia, Chile, France, New Zealand, Norway, and the UK claim territory, while the United States, Russia, and some other countries don't recognize any of these claims to territory. The Arctic, because of the 1982 UN Convention on the Law and Sea, it permitted countries to open up claims into the Arctic region, and you see countries starting to do that. Now we're switching gears a little bit here. This is the best time I could implement these two theories, which is what we're going to look at. The first is the Shatter belt theory. Regions that are politically fragmented and are often areas of competition between two ideological or two religious realms represent a shatter belt. Southeast Asia used to be a shatter belt because it was an area of repeated conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. The Middle East is still a shatter belt today. So just think of it as an area that there's continual fighting going on. Middle East has been a shatter belt forever and will continue to do so. And then the Heartland-Rimland theory. I want to identify what geopolitics means. Geopolitics is the study of how geographic space affects global politics. It was first coined by a man named Mackinder in 1904. Mackinder viewed the world as divided between a world island composed of Eurasia and Africa and the surrounding areas termed the Outer Crescent. The pivot area was the lands of Eastern Europe and Russia. Now I've got a quote for you.
Who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island controls the world.
Excuse me there. German Nazis sought to apply this theory in their grab of Eastern Europe and Russia. Other geopolitic theories used by the Germans was Lebensraum, or the living space theory. This became associated with territorial aggression and the subjugation of conquered peoples. It's kind of interesting that the German Nazis took geopolitics and these theories and applied it to their idea of world domination. Hitler was quite a historian.